Welcome back to our channel, where we uncover the most incredible true stories that will change how you see the world. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest discoveries. And if this story amazes you as much as it amazed us, please give it a thumbs up and let us know in the comments what you think about what you're about to hear. Trust me, you're going to want to share this one. At 68 years old, Dr. Elena Martinez thought she knew everything about ancient civilizations. After 45 years of digging through Guatemala's jungles, cataloging Maya artifacts, and teaching archaeology at Universidad de San Carlos, she believed she had uncovered all the secrets the past could offer. But when a simple DNA test arrived in her mailbox on a humid Tuesday morning in Guatemala City, everything she thought she knew about herself and the world was about to crumble like the ancient pyramids she'd spent her life studying. The results were impossible. According to the genetic analysis, Elena wasn't just descended from Maya people. She was the direct bloodline descendant of K-Inich Janab Pakal, the greatest ruler of the ancient Maya city of Palenque. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that somewhere in the Amazon rainforest of Guatemala, there was another person with identical royal DNA markers. A man named Carlos K-Inich, age 55, living in complete isolation with his indigenous community. Elena stared at the paper with trembling hands, her coffee growing cold on the kitchen table of her modest Guatemala City apartment. Outside, the sounds of morning traffic mixed with the calls of tropical birds, but inside her world, everything had gone silent. After 4.5 decades of studying Maya culture as an outsider, she was about to discover she had been an insider all along. Elena Martinez had built her entire career on the principle that the past should speak for itself. As she sat in her cluttered office at the university, surrounded by ceramic shards, jade ornaments, and countless photographs of pyramid excavations, she realized that the past had been speaking to her in ways she never understood. The DNA results lay spread across her desk like accusatory evidence. She picked up the phone 3 times to call her research assistant, Dr. James Patterson, but each time her finger hovered over the dial button before setting the phone back down. How do you tell your academic colleague of 20 years that you might be the living descendant of Maya royalty? How do you explain that your grandmother's bedtime stories about the old ways might not have been folklore at all? Elena's grandmother, Esperanza, had died when Elena was 15, but even now, 53 years later, she could hear the old woman's voice whispering stories in the darkness of their small village home. Stories about a great ancestor named Itzamna who could speak to the spirits of the ceiba trees. Stories about a sacred book that held the secrets of healing the world. Stories about a prophecy that would be fulfilled when the blood of kings reunites under the jaguar moon. At the time, Elena had dismissed these tales as the romantic imagination of an elderly woman who missed the old traditions. She had been so eager to escape village life, to study at the university, to become a modern woman of science. She had never looked back, never questioned why her grandmother knew so much about ancient Maya rituals, or why she sometimes spoke in words that sounded like the ancient Maya language Elena would later study in academic texts. The irony wasn't lost on her now. For decades, she had been documenting and preserving Maya culture while simultaneously running from her own heritage. She had become one of Guatemala's most respected archaeologists, published in international journals, invited to speak at conferences around the world. Yet she had never once considered that the blood running through her veins might connect her to the very civilizations she studied. Elena walked to her office window and looked out at the sprawling city below. Guatemala City stretched endlessly in all directions, a mixture of colonial architecture, modern buildings, and sprawling neighborhoods that climbed the surrounding hills like vegetation. Somewhere out there, in the remote rainforests that bordered Mexico and Belize, was a man named Carlos K-Inich, who shared her impossible bloodline. According to the DNA company's contact information, he lived in a community called Yaxmal, accessible only by boat and foot through some of the most challenging terrain in Central America. The rational part of Elena's mind, the part that had been trained in scientific methodology and peer review, told her this was all coincidence. DNA testing was still relatively new in Guatemala, and the databases were limited. There could be errors, contamination, false matches. But another part of her, a part that she had buried under decades of academic achievement, whispered that her grandmother's stories might have been more than just stories. Elena made her decision before she could talk herself out of it. She would find Carlos K. Adjective INICH. She would go to this community called Yaxmal and discover the truth about her heritage. After 45 years of digging up other people's pasts, it was time to excavate her own. The preparation for the journey took 3 weeks. Elena had been to remote archaeological sites before, but never as deep into the rainforest as Yaxmal appeared to be on the maps. She arranged for a leave of absence from the university, telling her department head that she was pursuing a personal research project of significant cultural importance. James Patterson, her longtime colleague and friend, insisted on accompanying her despite her protests that this was something she needed to do alone. "Elena," James had said, his weathered face creased with concern, "I've known you for 20 years. You've never taken an unplanned research trip in your life. You plan excavations 2 years in advance. This isn't like you." James was a British archaeologist who had come to Guatemala 15 years earlier to study Maya writing systems and had never left. His Spanish was still heavily accented, and his pale skin had never quite adapted to the tropical sun, but his dedication to Maya studies was unquestionable. "Maybe it's time I did something that wasn't like me," Elena had replied, but she was grateful for his concern. The truth was, she was terrified. Not of the jungle, not of the physical challenges of reaching Yaxmal, but of what she might discover about herself when she got there. They set out on a Monday morning in September, when the rainy season was beginning to ease, but the humidity still hung in the air like a living thing. Elena had hired a guide named Tomás, a weathered man in his 50s, who claimed to know every river and trail between Guatemala City and the Mexican border. He spoke 3 languages fluently: Spanish, English, and Q adjective EQCH, I adjective Maya, and had the kind of quiet confidence that comes from decades of navigating the wilderness. The first day of travel took them north by truck along increasingly deteriorating roads until they reached the town of Flores, near the famous ruins of Tikal. Elena had been to Tikal dozens of times, leading student groups and conducting research, but this time she saw the massive pyramids differently. Instead of archaeological specimens, they felt like ancestral monuments. The sensation was unsettling and profound at the same time. From Flores, they transferred to a smaller boat that would take them up the Usumacinta River toward the Mexican border. The river was muddy brown from recent rains, and the jungle pressed close on both sides, an impenetrable wall of green that seemed to swallow sound. Elena found herself listening to the water against the boat hull and wondering if this was how her ancestors had traveled centuries ago. "The community of Yaxmal is very traditional," Tomás explained as they navigated around a fallen tree that partially blocked the river. "They have minimal contact with the outside world. The leader, Carlos K. adjective INICH, is known throughout the region as a powerful daykeeper, a keeper of the ancient calendar and ceremonies. People travel for days to seek his guidance on matters of health and spiritual healing." Elena felt a chill despite the tropical heat. A daykeeper. Her grandmother had mentioned daykeepers in her stories, describing them as people who could read the patterns of time itself, who understood the connections between human lives and the movements of celestial bodies. Elena had studied the Maya calendar system extensively from an academic perspective, but she had never met someone who actually practiced the ancient timekeeping traditions. They traveled for 2 more days, transferring to progressively smaller boats and finally to canoes as the waterways narrowed. The jungle grew denser and more alive around them. Elena saw scarlet macaws flying overhead in pairs, their brilliant red and blue feathers flashing through the canopy. Howler monkeys called from invisible perches, their voices carrying for miles through the humid air. At night, they camped on riverbanks and Elena lay in her hammock, listening to a symphony of insects, frogs, and night birds that never seemed to sleep. On the third day, they abandoned the boats entirely and began hiking through the jungle on foot. The trail was barely visible, marked only by occasional slashes on tree trunks and the knowledge that Tamaz carried in his head. Elena's boots squelched through mud and rotting leaves, and she had to duck under low branches and step over fallen logs every few yards. Her clothes stuck to her skin, and insects buzzed constantly around her head, despite the repellent she had applied liberally that morning. But as challenging as the physical journey was, Elena found herself experiencing something unexpected, a sense of coming home. The sounds of the jungle, the smell of rich earth and growing things, the play of light and shadow through the canopy, all of it felt familiar in a way that made no logical sense. She had grown up in a small village, but not in jungle like this. She had spent her adult life in cities and archaeological sites, not in the deep rainforest. Yet every step felt like a memory. Late in the afternoon of the third day, Tamaz stopped abruptly and held up his hand for silence. Elena and James froze behind him, straining to hear whatever had caught his attention. After a moment, Elena heard it, the sound of human voices carried on the breeze, speaking in a language she couldn't quite identify, but that sounded hauntingly familiar. "We are close now," Tamaz said quietly. "From here, we walk slowly and announce ourselves. The people of Yaxmul are peaceful, but they are cautious of strangers." They continued forward more carefully, and within 20 minutes Elena could see smoke rising from cooking fires through the trees. Then the jungle opened into a clearing, and she got her first glimpse of Yaxmul. The community was unlike anything Elena had seen in her decades of archaeological work. It wasn't a recreation of ancient Maya life, nor was it a modern indigenous community trying to balance tradition with contemporary needs. Yaxmul seemed to exist in its own time, where ancient ways had never been interrupted by conquest or colonization. Traditional Maya houses made of wood and palm thatch were arranged around a central plaza where several families were working together to prepare food, weave textiles, and tend to children. Gardens of corn, beans, and squash surrounded the houses, along with fruit trees and medicinal plants that Elena recognized from her botanical studies. But what struck her most powerfully was the people themselves. Men, women, and children moved through their daily activities with a sense of purpose and peace that Elena rarely saw in the modern world. They spoke to each other in what Elena realized must be ancient Maya, a language she had studied in written form but had never heard spoken fluently. Children played games that involved arranging stones in patterns that looked suspiciously like mathematical calculations. Women wove textiles with designs that Elena had seen only in ancient ceramics and stone carvings. As they emerged from the tree line, a young girl of perhaps 12 years old noticed them first. Instead of running away or calling for adults in alarm, she approached them with curious confidence. She spoke to Tamaz in Maya, and Elena was surprised to realize she could understand fragments of the conversation. The girl was asking who they were and what they wanted, but in a polite, welcoming way rather than with suspicion. Tamaz responded in Maya, explaining that they had come to see Carlos K. Adjective, INICH, that one of them shared his blood and had traveled far to meet him. The girl's eyes widened slightly, and she looked directly at Elena with an intensity that was unsettling. After a moment, she nodded and gestured for them to follow her toward the center of the village. Word of their arrival spread quickly through the community, but rather than gathering to stare at the strangers, people continued their work while observing the visitors with discreet interest. Elena noticed that many of the adults had the same high cheekbones and distinctive nose shape that she had always been told were her Maya features. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel physically different from the people around her. The girl led them to a house that was larger than the others, distinguished by more elaborate carvings around the doorframe, and a garden that contained dozens of plants Elena recognized as having medicinal properties. As they approached, a man emerged from the shadows of the doorway, and Elena's breath caught in her throat. Carlos K. Adjective, INICH, was tall for a Maya man, probably close to 6 feet, with graying hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His face was weathered from decades of life outdoors, but his movements were fluid and graceful. He wore simple clothes, cotton pants and a woven shirt, but carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to leadership and respect. But what struck Elena most powerfully was that looking at Carlos was like looking at a male version of herself. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable. The shape of their eyes, the way they carried their shoulders, the way their hands moved when they spoke. This was what familial DNA looked like when it expressed itself across centuries. Carlos studied Elena for a long moment before speaking in accented but clear Spanish. "Elena Martinez," he said, and Elena realized that news of her coming had somehow preceded them. "I have been expecting you." "Expecting me," Elena managed to say, her academic composure deserting her completely. Carlos smiled, and the expression transformed his serious face into something warm and almost familiar. "The dreams told me you were coming. 3 weeks ago, the spirits began showing me visions of a woman with the face of our ancestors, carrying knowledge but searching for wisdom. They told me she would come when the world needed healing, and that together we would remember what our people had forgotten." Elena felt James shift nervously beside her. As a fellow academic, he was clearly struggling with the mystical aspects of this encounter. But Elena found herself less skeptical than she expected to be. After spending 3 days in the jungle feeling inexplicably drawn toward this place, after a lifetime of being inexplicably drawn to Maya culture, after her grandmother's stories that had seemed like fantasy but were proving to contain threads of truth, she was prepared to suspend her disbelief. "I received DNA test results," Elena said carefully, "indicating that we share the same ancestral bloodline. The same royal bloodline of the ancient Maya kings." Carlos nodded as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "Of course you did. The blood calls to the blood. But the DNA is only the beginning, Dr. Martinez. You have come here for something much more important than genetic confirmation." "What do you mean?" "Come," Carlos said, gesturing toward his house. "There are things you need to see, things you need to remember. And there is someone you need to meet." Elena followed Carlos into his house, with James and Tamaz close behind. The interior was simple but comfortable, lit by natural light from windows and doorways, and filled with the scents of burning copal incense and medicinal herbs. Maya textiles hung on the walls alongside botanical specimens and what appeared to be star charts drawn on bark paper. But Elena's attention was immediately drawn to a girl who appeared to be around 12 years old, sitting cross-legged on a woven mat in the center of the room. She was the same girl who had greeted them at the edge of the village, but seeing her in this context, Elena realized she was much more than just a curious child. "This is my daughter, Anna," Carlos said with obvious pride. "She has been gifted with the sight, the ability to see across time and into the spaces between the visible world. She has been dreaming of you since she was very small." Anna looked up at Elena with eyes that seemed far older than her 12 years. When she spoke, it was in Spanish accented with Maya intonations, but her words were precise and confident. "You have been lost for a long time, Grandmother Elena," Anna said, and Elena felt a shock at being called grandmother by a child she had just met. "But you were never really lost. You were just walking in circles, getting closer to where you needed to be." I don't understand, Elena said, sitting down on a wooden stool that Carlos offered her. Your spirit has been searching for its home, Anna explained patiently. You thought your home was in books and universities, in digging up old stones and pottery. But your real home is in the knowledge that runs in your blood, the knowledge that your grandmother tried to teach you before you learned to think it was primitive superstition. Elena felt tears welling up in her eyes, though she couldn't quite say why. My grandmother told me stories, but I thought they were just stories. All truth begins as stories, Carlos said, settling onto a mat across from Elena. Your grandmother, Esperanza, was wise to plant the seeds of remembering in your mind, even when you were too young to understand their importance. But now you are ready to understand. Now the world is ready for what you carry. What I carry? Elena asked. Anna leaned forward, her young face serious. You carry the memory of the Codex, Grandmother Elena. The sacred book that holds the healing knowledge of our ancestors. Your bloodline has been protecting the location of this codex for 500 years, passing the secret from grandmother to granddaughter, waiting for the time when it would be needed again. Elena's scientific mind rebelled against the mystical implications of what Anna was saying, but another part of her was remembering fragments of her grandmother's stories. Stories about a sacred book hidden in a place where the jaguar and the serpent meet. Stories about healing knowledge that could cure diseases that modern medicine couldn't touch. Stories about a prophecy that spoke of a time when the earth itself would be sick, and only the ancient wisdom could heal it. I don't remember any specific location, Elena said carefully. My grandmother told me stories, but she never gave me a map or specific directions to anything. Carlos smiled. The memory is not in your conscious mind, Dr. Martinez. It is deeper than that. It is written in your dreams, in the places your spirit feels drawn to, in the knowledge that comes to you without learning. This is why you became an archaeologist, though you convinced yourself it was intellectual curiosity. This is why you could never quite feel at home in the modern world, though you achieved great success in it. Your spirit has been searching for the Codex your entire life. James, who had been quietly observing this conversation with growing confusion and concern, finally spoke up. Elena, I think we should approach this with some healthy skepticism. I understand that discovering your genetic heritage is exciting, but we shouldn't let emotional responses override our commitment to scientific methodology. Elena appreciated James's concern, but she found herself irritated by his interruption. James, I've spent 45 years applying scientific methodology to Maya culture. I think I can allow myself a few days to explore other ways of understanding my heritage. Of course, James said quickly, but claims about mystical bloodlines and ancient codices require evidence. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as Carl Sagan said. Anna looked at James with the patient expression of a teacher dealing with a slow student. Patterson, she said, pronouncing his name carefully, what evidence would satisfy your scientific mind? If we showed you healing techniques that work, but have no explanation in your medical books. If we showed you astronomical knowledge that your observatories are only beginning to discover. If we showed you agricultural methods that produce more food with less environmental damage than your industrial farming. James shifted uncomfortably. Well, those would certainly be worth investigating, but you would find ways to explain them that fit your existing framework of understanding, Anna finished. You would say that traditional medicine sometimes works through the placebo effect or active compounds that haven't been identified yet. You would say that ancient astronomers had more time to observe the sky without light pollution. You would say that traditional farming methods work because indigenous people had centuries to develop them through trial and error. Elena found herself impressed by the 12-year-old's sophisticated understanding of academic skepticism. Anna makes a good point, James. We often approach indigenous knowledge systems with predetermined assumptions about what is possible and what isn't. All I'm suggesting, James said defensively, is that we maintain our critical thinking faculties. Carlos had been listening to this exchange with amusement. Patterson, your critical thinking faculties are welcome here. We are not asking you to abandon your scientific training. We are asking you to expand it. The ancient Maya were scientists too, astronomers, mathematicians, physicians, agriculturalists. They simply used a different framework for organizing and applying their knowledge. A framework that included what you would call spiritual dimensions, Anna added. But spiritual doesn't mean unreal or unverifiable. It means connected to aspects of reality that your instruments haven't learned to measure yet. Elena felt a deep resonance with Anna's words. Throughout her career, she had been struck by the sophistication of ancient Maya knowledge systems, but she had always approached them through the lens of Western academic categories. What if there were ways of understanding and applying knowledge that didn't fit neatly into those categories, but were nonetheless valid and useful? I'd like to learn more, Elena said. About the knowledge systems, about the prophecy Anna mentioned, about this codex. I'm willing to approach it with an open mind, even if it challenges my academic assumptions. Carlos nodded approvingly. Good. But learning will require more than just listening and observing. It will require participating in ways that might feel uncomfortable for someone trained in Western academic traditions. It will require trusting knowledge that comes through dreams and visions, not just through books and excavations. I understand, Elena said, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. Do you? Anna asked, tilting her head and studying Elena's face. Because the first step in remembering where the codex is hidden will require you to drink the sacred medicine that opens the doors between the worlds. Are you prepared for that? Elena felt her heart rate accelerate. She had read about traditional Maya use of psychoactive plants in ceremonial contexts, but she had never imagined participating in such practices herself. The academic part of her mind immediately began cataloging potential risks and ethical considerations. But another part of her, the part that had been growing stronger since she arrived in Yaxmul, whispered that this was exactly what she had come here to do. What kind of medicine? She asked. We call it the teacher, Carlos explained. A plant preparation that has been used by our people for thousands of years to expand consciousness and access knowledge that is normally hidden. It allows the drinker to see beyond the limitations of ordinary perception, to remember things that have been forgotten, to communicate with the wisdom of the ancestors. James looked alarmed. Elena, that sounds like you're talking about ayahuasca or some other hallucinogenic compound. There could be serious health risks, especially at your age. And the legal implications. James, Elena said firmly, I appreciate your concern, but this is my decision to make. I came here to discover the truth about my heritage, not to play it safe. The medicine is completely safe when taken in the proper context with proper guidance, Carlos assured them. I have been a ceremonialist for over 30 years. Anna has been trained in the traditional ways since she was very young. You would be in experienced hands. Elena looked around the room, taking in the medicinal plants, the star charts, the serene confidence of Carlos and Anna. Everything rational in her background told her to be cautious, to think this through, to consider the potential consequences. But everything intuitive in her spirit told her that this was why she had come here, that this was the moment her entire life had been leading toward. When would this ceremony take place? She asked. Tomorrow night, Anna said. During the new moon, when the veil between the worlds is thinnest. But first, you must prepare. You must fast today and tomorrow, drink only water and herbal teas. You must spend time in meditation, setting your intention to remember what your bloodline carries. And you must speak with your grandmother's spirit, asking for her guidance and protection. Elena felt a chill, the mention of communicating with her grandmother's spirit. Esperanza had been dead for 53 years. Elena had attended the funeral, had grieved the loss, had moved on with her life. The idea that her grandmother's spirit could somehow still be accessible felt like a category error, a confusion between metaphor and literal reality. But as she sat in Carlos's house, surrounded by the sounds and smells of a world that felt both foreign and familiar, Elena found her certainty about the boundaries of reality beginning to soften. If her DNA could connect her to ancestors she had never known existed, if her dreams could guide her to a place she had never heard of, if a 12-year-old girl could speak with the wisdom of someone many times her age, then perhaps the categories she had used to organize her understanding of the world were not as fixed as she had assumed. "I'll prepare for the ceremony," Elena said, and as she spoke the words, she felt something fundamental shift inside her. For the first time in her adult life, she was committing to an action based on intuition rather than analysis, on faith rather than evidence. Carlos smiled, and Anna clapped her hands together in delight. "Good, Grandmother Elena. Your spirit is remembering how to be brave." Elena spent the rest of that day, and all of the following day in a state of quiet preparation. Carlos showed her to a small guest house at the edge of the village, where she could rest and meditate. The structure was simple but comfortable, with woven mats on the floor, mosquito netting over the sleeping area, and a small altar that held flowers, stones, and burning copal incense. James remained concerned about Elena's decision, but he occupied himself by observing and documenting the daily life of Yaxmul with the methodical attention of an experienced ethnographer. Elena could see him struggling to reconcile his academic skepticism with the obvious sophistication and harmony of the community. The people of Yaxmul were clearly not primitive or superstitious in any sense that matched Western stereotypes. They were intelligent, skilled, knowledgeable, and purposeful in ways that challenged easy categorization. Elena fasted as instructed, consuming only water and herbal teas that Carlos prepared for her. The hunger was manageable, but the mental clarity that came with it was unexpected. Without the distraction of processing food, her mind seemed to settle into a state of calm alertness that she rarely experienced in her normal life. She found herself noticing details she might ordinarily miss: the way light filtered through the palm thatch roof, the complex harmonies of bird songs, the subtle fragrances of the medicinal plants that surrounded the guest house. Following Anna's guidance, Elena spent hours sitting quietly and trying to open her mind to communication with her grandmother's spirit. At first, this felt artificial and forced. Elena had been trained to think critically, to distinguish between imagination and reality, to base conclusions on verifiable evidence. Deliberately trying to communicate with a dead person felt like a betrayal of everything she had learned about rational thinking. But as the hours passed and her mind grew quieter, Elena began to have experiences that didn't fit her usual categories. Sometimes she would catch a whiff of her grandmother's distinctive scent, a mixture of the medicinal herbs Esperanza had grown in her garden and the copal incense she had burned during what she called her prayers to the old ones. Sometimes Elena would hear fragments of her grandmother's voice, speaking in the mixture of Spanish and Maya that had been their private language when Elena was very young. Most powerfully, Elena began to remember dreams she had been having for decades but had never paid attention to. Dreams of walking through jungle paths toward a place where carved stone jaguars faced each other across a cenote, one of the natural limestone sinkholes that the Maya had considered sacred. Dreams of following an underground river through caverns filled with stalactites that glowed with their own inner light. Dreams of a chamber where ancient books rested on stone shelves, protected by guardians that were neither quite human nor quite animal. Elena had always been a vivid dreamer, but she had learned to dismiss her dreams as random neural activity, meaningless products of a sleeping brain processing the day's experiences. Now, as she sat in meditation trying to remember what her bloodline carried, these dreams began to feel like something else entirely. They began to feel like memories passed down through generations, genetic programming that had been waiting for the right circumstances to activate. As the sun set on the second day, Elena felt a mixture of anticipation and terror about the ceremony that would take place that night. She had committed to drinking an unknown psychoactive substance with people she had known for less than 48 hours, in a place where medical help would be days away if anything went wrong. Every rational instinct told her this was dangerous and foolish. But another part of her, a part that seemed to be growing stronger with each hour she spent in Yaxmul, felt that this was the most important thing she had ever committed to do. For 68 years, she had been living as half of herself, denying and suppressing the heritage that ran in her blood, approaching her own culture as if she were a detached observer rather than a participant. Tomorrow, she would either remember who she really was, or she would discover that her grandmother's stories were just stories after all. As darkness fell, Carlos came to escort Elena to the ceremony site. She had expected to be nervous, but instead she felt calm and focused. The fasting and meditation had brought her to a state of mental clarity she rarely experienced, and the sounds of the jungle at night, the calls of owls and nightjars, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the splash of fish jumping in distant streams, felt like a familiar lullaby. They walked through the village and beyond, following a path that Elena hadn't noticed during the day. After about 20 minutes, they emerged into a clearing where Anna waited beside a small fire. The firelight illuminated her young face, but her expression was serious and ceremonial. She had changed from her everyday clothes into a traditional Maya huipil, a woven dress with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering light. "Welcome, Grandmother Elena," Anna said formally. "Are you ready to remember?" Elena looked around the clearing. Stone monuments carved with Maya glyphs marked the cardinal directions, and she could hear the sound of water somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. The air was thick with the scent of copal incense and night-blooming flowers. "I'm ready," Elena said, and surprised herself by meaning it completely. Carlos gestured for Elena to sit on a woven mat near the fire. From a gourd bowl, he poured a small amount of dark liquid that looked like concentrated plant matter dissolved in water. The smell was earthy and bitter, with undertones of something that reminded Elena of her grandmother's medicine garden. "Drink slowly," Carlos instructed, "and set your intention clearly. Ask to remember what your bloodline carries. Ask to see the path to the healing knowledge that the world needs now." Elena took the bowl in both hands and looked at the dark liquid. This was her last chance to change her mind, to retreat into the safety of academic skepticism and rational analysis. She could hand the bowl back to Carlos, thank him for his hospitality, and return to Guatemala City with an interesting story about discovering her genetic heritage and meeting distant relatives in the rainforest. Instead, she lifted the bowl to her lips and drank. The taste was intensely bitter, with a complexity that suggested multiple plant medicines had been combined in the preparation. Elena managed not to grimace as she swallowed, though her stomach cramped slightly in response to the unfamiliar substances. "Now we wait," Anna said, settling onto her own mat across the fire from Elena. "And we sing the songs that call to the ancestors, that open the doors between the worlds." Anna began to sing in Maya, her clear young voice rising and falling in patterns that seemed to match the rhythms of the jungle around them. Carlos joined her, his deeper voice creating harmonies that resonated in Elena's chest. Elena didn't understand all the words, but the melodies felt familiar, as if she had heard them in dreams or in the deepest layers of memory. For the first half hour, Elena felt nothing except the effects of fasting and staying up past her usual bedtime. She began to wonder if the medicine would work for her, if perhaps her decades of academic rationalism had somehow insulated her from whatever psychological or neurological changes the plant was supposed to induce. Then, gradually, she began to notice that the firelight seemed brighter and more complex than before. The flames weren't just orange and yellow, but contained subtle variations of color that shifted and danced in patterns that seemed almost intentional. The sounds of the jungle grew more distinct and layered, as if her hearing had suddenly become more sensitive to subtle frequencies and distances. Elena's sense of time began to shift. The singing of Carlos and Anna seemed to stretch and contract, sometimes feeling like it had been going on for hours, other times feeling like it had just begun. The boundaries between her individual consciousness and the broader environment started to feel less distinct. She could sense the presence of the trees around the clearing, could feel their slow, patient awareness like a background hum in her mind. And then, gradually, she began to see things that weren't visible in ordinary consciousness. The first was her grandmother, Esperanza, sitting beside Anna across the fire. Not as Elena remembered her from childhood, an elderly woman in simple village clothes, but as she must have been in her youth, radiating strength and knowledge and connection to powers that Elena was only beginning to understand. Esperanza smiled at Elena with infinite love and approval. "Mija," her grandmother said in the voice Elena remembered from childhood, "you have finally come home." Elena wanted to respond, but found that her voice seemed to be coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper than her usual speaking voice. "Abulita, I'm sorry I forgot. I'm sorry I didn't listen to your stories." "You were supposed to forget for a while," Esperanza said gently. "You were supposed to learn the ways of the modern world, to become educated in their systems of knowledge. But now it is time to remember what your education prepared you to understand." The fire between them began to change, growing larger and brighter until it seemed to fill Elena's entire field of vision. Within the flames, she began to see images that moved like a living documentary of the past. She saw her ancestors in the time before the Spanish conquest, living in a great Maya city that she somehow knew was Palenque. She saw the arrival of the conquistadors, the destruction of the temples and libraries, the desperate efforts to hide the most sacred knowledge before it could be destroyed. She saw a young woman, one of her direct ancestors, fleeing into the jungle with a bundle wrapped in jaguar skin, carrying it to a place where it would be safe until the time came for it to be revealed again. The images shifted and flowed, showing Elena generation after generation of women in her family line, each one receiving and protecting the knowledge of where the sacred Codex was hidden. She saw her great-great-grandmother teaching the secret to her daughter through stories and songs. She saw her great-grandmother passing the knowledge to her daughter through dreams and visions. She saw her grandmother, Esperanza, trying to plant the seeds of remembering in young Elena's mind through bedtime stories that Elena had dismissed as folklore. "The Codex," Elena heard herself saying, though her voice seemed to come from far away. "Where is it hidden?" The images in the fire shifted again, and Elena saw herself as if from above, walking through jungle paths toward a place where two rivers met. She saw the stone jaguars from her dreams, facing each other across a cenote that glowed with deep blue water. She saw herself descending into the cenote, following an underwater passage that led to a hidden chamber where the Codex waited on stone shelves, protected by guardians that were neither fully human nor fully animal. But as the vision continued, Elena began to understand that the Codex was more than just an ancient book. It was a living repository of knowledge that connected healing wisdom, astronomical observations, mathematical insights, and spiritual understanding in ways that her academic training had never taught her to imagine. The Codex didn't just contain information. It contained the keys to understanding how consciousness itself could be used as a tool for healing, both individual bodies and the larger body of the earth. "The world is sick now," her grandmother's voice said, seeming to come from the fire itself. "The old sickness of separation, where people have forgotten that they are part of the living web of all existence. The Codex holds the medicine for this sickness, But only those who remember their connection to the ancient wisdom can retrieve it and apply it. Elena felt herself rising above the scene, seeing not just the hidden chamber with the Codex, but the larger pattern of which it was a part. She saw how the knowledge contained in the sacred book was connected to other repositories of wisdom hidden around the world, in the pyramids of Egypt, in the sacred caves of Tibet, in the underground chambers beneath Stonehenge. She saw how all of these repositories were part of a single system of knowledge that had been preserved by different cultures, but was fundamentally unified in its understanding of how consciousness, healing, and cosmic harmony were interconnected. Your work as an archaeologist prepared you for this moment, Anna's voice said, though Elena couldn't see the girl anywhere in the swirling visions. You learned to dig beneath the surface, to piece together fragments of the past, to see patterns that others missed. But now you must use those same skills to dig into the landscape of consciousness itself, to piece together the fragments of ancestral memory that live in your blood. The visions began to fade, and Elena found herself back in the clearing with Carlos and Anna, though the fire still seemed unnaturally bright, and the jungle around them still pulsed with living awareness. She felt different, not just mentally or emotionally, but physically. It was as if some part of her that had been sleeping for 68 years had finally awakened. I know where it is, Elena said, and her voice sounded different to her own ears, more resonant and confident than usual. I can see the path to the cenote, the way down into the underwater chamber. But it's not just about retrieving the Codex. It's about understanding what the knowledge means, how to apply it in the modern world. Carlos nodded gravely. The seeing is only the beginning, Doctor. Martinez. The Codex has been waiting for someone who could bridge the ancient wisdom and modern understanding, someone who could translate the healing knowledge into forms that contemporary people could accept and use. This is why your spirit chose to be born into a family that would forget the old ways long enough for you to master the new ones. But I'm just one person, Elena protested. And I'm 68 years old. How can I possibly undertake something this significant at this stage of my life? Anna laughed, a sound like water flowing over stones. Grandmother Elena, you speak as if 68 were ancient. You have at least 20 more years of active life ahead of you, probably more. And you won't be working alone. Your discovery of the Codex will call others to join you, people who have been waiting their whole lives for this knowledge to be revealed, even if they didn't know what they were waiting for. Elena looked around the clearing, trying to process what had happened to her. The effects of the plant medicine were beginning to fade, but she retained perfect clarity about the visions she had experienced. She could remember every detail of the path to the cenote, every nuance of the underwater passage, every element of the chamber where the Codex waited. More than that, she could feel in her body the reality of the healing knowledge the ancient book contained. There's something else, Elena said slowly. Something about the timing. The visions showed me that the Codex can only be retrieved during specific astronomical alignments, when the positions of the planets create the right energetic conditions for accessing the chamber. The next alignment. She paused, calculating based on the astronomical knowledge she had gained from studying Maya calendar systems. The next alignment is in 3 weeks, during the spring equinox. Carlos and Anna exchanged a meaningful look. The prophecy speaks of this timing, Carlos said. When the blood of kings reunites under the jaguar moon, when the earth itself cries out for healing, when the old knowledge must return to restore balance. All of these conditions are present now. What do you mean, the earth is crying out for healing? Elena asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Anna's young face grew serious. Climate change, environmental destruction, the pollution of water and air, the extinction of species, the spread of diseases that resist all treatments. These are not separate problems. They are symptoms of the same fundamental sickness, the forgetting of the connection between human consciousness and the living systems of the planet. Elena felt a chill of recognition. Throughout her career, She had watched with growing concern as archaeological sites were threatened by environmental degradation, as indigenous communities were displaced by development projects, as ancient knowledge systems were lost to modernization. She had always seen these as unfortunate side effects of progress, but now she began to understand them as symptoms of a deeper crisis. The Codex contains the antidote to this sickness, Carlos continued. But not in the way that modern people usually think about medicine. It's not a collection of herbal remedies or technical solutions. It's a manual for remembering how to live in conscious relationship with the living intelligence of the earth itself. Elena spent the rest of the night in the clearing with Carlos and Anna, as the plant medicine gradually wore off and ordinary consciousness returned. But even as her perception returned to normal ranges, she retained an unshakable certainty about what she had experienced. The visions weren't hallucinations or wishful thinking. They were memories encoded in her genetic heritage, finally accessible because she had learned to trust knowledge that came through channels other than rational analysis. As dawn approached, they walked back to the village in comfortable silence. Elena felt profoundly changed by the night's experiences, but she also felt grounded and practical. She knew what she needed to do next, and she had a clear sense of how to proceed. James was waiting anxiously at the guest house when they returned. "Elena, are you all right? You've been gone all night, and I was beginning to worry that something had gone wrong." Elena looked at her old friend and colleague, seeing him now through eyes that had been fundamentally altered by the previous night's experiences. James represented the best of Western academic tradition, rigorous, careful, committed to evidence-based reasoning. These were valuable qualities that Elena didn't want to abandon. But they were no longer the only tools she would use to understand the world. "I'm fine, James. Better than fine, actually. But I need to tell you about what happened, and I need to ask for your help with something that's going to challenge everything we thought we knew about Maya civilization." Over the next several hours, Elena told James about her visions, about the location of the hidden codex, about the healing knowledge it contained, and the urgent need to retrieve it. She expected him to be skeptical, to raise objections based on scientific methodology and rational analysis. Instead, James listened with growing fascination and concern. "Elena," he said when she finished, "I've been observing this community for the past 2 days, and I have to admit that what I've seen here challenges a lot of my assumptions about indigenous knowledge systems. The agricultural techniques they use are producing yields that shouldn't be possible without modern fertilizers and pesticides. The medicinal treatments I've watched them apply seem to be genuinely effective for conditions that would normally require pharmaceutical intervention. And the children here demonstrate mathematical and astronomical knowledge that exceeds what most university students possess." Elena felt a surge of gratitude for James's intellectual honesty. "So you're willing to help me retrieve the codex?" "I'm willing to help you investigate the site you described," James said carefully. "If there really is a hidden chamber containing ancient Maya books that have survived for 500 years, it would be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in history. The fact that you located the site through unconventional means doesn't invalidate the potential importance of what might be found there." Elena smiled. This was exactly the kind of response she had hoped for from James, open-minded enough to take the investigation seriously, but grounded enough to maintain scholarly standards. Over the following week, Elena, James, Carlos, and Anna worked together to plan the expedition to retrieve the codex. The site Elena had seen in her visions was located about 2 days' journey deeper into the rainforest, in an area that was particularly challenging to reach. They would need specialized equipment for underwater exploration, provisions for an extended stay in a remote location, and careful planning to ensure they could access the chamber during the brief window when the astronomical alignment would make it possible. Carlos proved to have extensive knowledge of the terrain they would need to cross, and Anna demonstrated an uncanny ability to interpret Elena's vision memories and translate them into practical guidance. James applied his archaeological expertise to planning the documentation and preservation of whatever they might find, while Elena found herself serving as the bridge between ancient wisdom and modern methodology. The more time Elena spent in Yaxmul, the more she understood that her transformation was not just personal, but part of a larger awakening that was beginning to happen around the world. Carlos told her about other indigenous communities that were experiencing dreams and visions, calling them to remember ancient knowledge. Anna described communications she had received from young people in other countries who were spontaneously developing abilities to see across time and space, to heal through conscious intention, to understand the languages of plants and animals. The old prophecies speak of this time, Carlos explained one evening as they sat around a fire planning their expedition. The time when the ancient wisdom would return to heal the world's sickness. But it's not just about retrieving old knowledge. It's about creating new forms of understanding that integrate the best of ancient wisdom with the best of modern learning. Elena found herself thinking constantly about her life back in Guatemala City, about her career at the university, about the papers she was supposed to be writing and the conferences she was supposed to be attending. All of that seemed increasingly distant and irrelevant compared to the work she was being called to do. But she also realized that she couldn't simply abandon her academic identity. Her credentials, her relationships with other scholars, her institutional connections, all of these would be essential for bringing the Codex's knowledge into forms that the modern world could accept and utilize. I think I understand now why I had to spend all those years in the academic world, Elena told Anna one afternoon as they gathered medicinal plants together. I needed to learn the language that modern people speak, to understand how knowledge is validated and transmitted in contemporary institutions. The Codex contains wisdom that could help heal the environmental and social crises we're facing, but it won't do any good if it remains locked away in indigenous communities that the dominant culture dismisses as primitive or superstitious. Anna nodded thoughtfully. You will become a translator, Grandmother Elena. Not just of languages, but of ways of knowing. You will help the ancient wisdom speak in voices that modern people can hear. The day before they were scheduled to depart for the Codex site, Elena had an unexpected visitor. Tamaz, the guide who had brought them to Yaxmul, returned to the village with news from the outside world. Government officials in Guatemala City were asking questions about Elena's whereabouts. Her extended absence from the university had been noticed, and there were concerns about her well-being. They think you might have been kidnapped or gotten lost in the jungle, Tamaz reported. There's talk of organizing a search and rescue operation. Elena felt a stab of concern. The last thing she wanted was for government officials or military personnel to descend on Yaxmul, potentially disrupting the community's peaceful isolation and certainly making it impossible to retrieve the Codex without unwanted attention. I need to contact the university, Elena decided. I'll tell them that I'm safe and conducting important research, but I need more time to complete it. Carlos looked troubled. Any contact with the outside world creates the risk that others will learn about what we're attempting to do. There are people who would try to stop us from retrieving the Codex, either because they don't believe in its value or because they want to control its knowledge for their own purposes. Elena understood Carlos's concern, but she also knew that completely disappearing from her normal life would eventually bring exactly the kind of attention they wanted to avoid. Let me contact my department head and arrange for an extended research leave. I'll be vague about the details, but I'll provide enough information to satisfy their concerns about my safety. The next morning, Tamaz guided Elena to a town several hours away that had cell phone coverage. Elena called Dr. Patricia Morales, the head of the archaeology department at Universidad de San Carlos, and explained that she had discovered evidence of a previously unknown Maya site that could significantly expand understanding of pre-Columbian civilizations. Elena, this is very unlike you, Doctor, Morales said with concern evident in her voice. You've never undertaken fieldwork without proper permits and institutional support. What exactly have you found? Elena chose her words carefully. I can't provide full details yet, Patricia, because I need to complete my initial assessment before involving other parties. But I can tell you that this discovery has the potential to revolutionize how we understand Maya knowledge systems, particularly their medical and astronomical traditions. How long do you need? Give me 3 months, Elena requested. If my investigation confirms what I believe I've found, I'll need time to document it properly and plan for a formal expedition with proper institutional backing. Morales was silent for a moment. Elena, you've been one of our most respected faculty members for decades. I trust your judgment. But please be careful, and please stay in regular contact. If you don't check in at least once a week, I'll have to report your situation to the authorities. Elena agreed to the weekly check-ins, knowing that this would complicate their expedition, but recognizing that it was necessary to maintain her connection to the academic world. After ending the call, she and Tamaz began the journey back to Yaxmul, where Carlos, Anna, and James were completing preparations for their departure to the Codex site. The expedition began the following dawn. Elena, James, Carlos, Anna, and 2 other men from Yaxmul set out into the deepest part of the rainforest, carrying equipment and supplies for what could be a week-long journey. Elena had been in challenging terrain before, but nothing quite like this. The jungle was so dense in places that they had to cut their way through with machetes, and the humidity was so intense that Elena's clothes were soaked with perspiration within the first hour. But as difficult as the physical journey was, Elena found herself energized by a sense of purpose, unlike anything she had experienced in her academic career. She was no longer just studying Maya civilization from the outside, she was participating in the living continuation of Maya wisdom traditions. Every step brought her closer to knowledge that had been waiting for her specifically, knowledge that her bloodline had been protecting for 5 centuries. Carlos and Anna proved to be extraordinary guides, navigating through terrain that had no visible trails and finding water sources and safe camping spots with uncanny accuracy. Elena began to understand that they were using forms of environmental awareness that went far beyond what she had learned in her wilderness training. They seemed to be reading the landscape through multiple senses, picking up information from the behavior of animals, the patterns of plant growth, even the subtle variations in air pressure and humidity. On the 2nd day of travel, they reached the confluence of 2 rivers that Elena recognized from her visions. The water was clear and dark, flowing swiftly between banks lined with massive cecropia trees and flowering heliconias. Fish jumped in the deeper pools, and colorful butterflies fluttered around patches of sunlight that penetrated the canopy. We're close now, Anna announced, though to Elena the landscape still looked like undifferentiated jungle. The jaguars are calling us forward. Elena listened carefully, but couldn't hear anything that sounded like jaguars. Then Carlos pointed to a tree about 50 yards ahead, where 2 large cats were lounging on a broad branch, watching the human expedition with calm interest. They're not afraid of us, James observed with amazement. It's as if they were expecting us. They were, Anna said simply. The guardians of this place have been waiting for us just as long as the Codex has. They continued following the river for another hour, until they reached a place where the waterway widened into a natural pool, surrounded by limestone cliffs. Elena's heart rate accelerated as she recognized the scene from her visions. Carved into the stone faces on either side of the pool were massive jaguar heads, their mouths open, as if roaring silently across the water toward each other. The cenote, Elena breathed. This is it. The pool was larger than it had appeared in her visions, perhaps 50 yards across, and surrounded by steep stone walls that dropped directly into dark water. Elena could see that the cenote was deeper than any natural swimming hole, its depths disappearing into blue-black mystery. Carlos began unpacking diving equipment from his backpack, including masks, fins, and underwater lights that he had somehow acquired for this expedition. The entrance to the chamber is about 30 feet down, he explained. There's an underwater tunnel that leads to an air-filled cavern where the Codex is stored. Elena felt a moment of panic. She was a competent swimmer, but she had never done any serious underwater exploration, and the idea of swimming through a submerged tunnel into an unknown underground space was terrifying. I can guide you, Anna offered. In the spirit world, I can see the path clearly and help you navigate safely. Elena looked at the 12-year-old girl with amazement. Anna, you're not suggesting that you're coming down there with us. Not in my physical body, Anna clarified. But my spirit can travel underwater and show you the way. You'll be able to see me if you open your inner vision the way you did during the ceremony. James had been examining the carved jaguar heads with professional interest. Elena, these sculptures are extraordinary. The craftsmanship is consistent with classic Maya work, but the preservation is remarkable. It's as if they were carved yesterday. The limestone here has special properties, Carlos explained. It protects and preserves anything that rests within it. This is why our ancestors chose this place to hide their most precious knowledge. Elena spent the next hour mentally preparing herself for the underwater journey. Carlos showed her how to use the diving equipment and practiced with her in the shallower areas of the cenote until she felt confident with the mechanics of underwater breathing and movement. Anna sat in meditation by the water's edge, preparing to project her consciousness into the aquatic realm. As the sun reached its highest point, the astronomically significant moment when the retrieval could take place, Elena slipped into the dark water of the cenote. The temperature was surprisingly warm, and the water was so clear that she could see all the way to the bottom despite the depth. Strange rock formations created underwater landscapes that were both beautiful and otherworldly. Carlos descended beside her, carrying waterproof lights and equipment for documenting whatever they found. At 30 feet, Elena saw the entrance to the tunnel, a perfectly circular opening in the limestone wall that was obviously artificial rather than natural. The tunnel was large enough for them to swim through comfortably, but being underwater in an enclosed space triggered every survival instinct Elena possessed. Then she saw Anna, or rather Anna's spirit form, glowing with soft silver light in the dark water ahead of them. The girl's spiritual presence radiated calm confidence, and Elena felt her fear dissolving as she followed Anna's guidance through the tunnel. The underwater passage was longer than Elena had expected, perhaps 50 yards of swimming through limestone corridors that twisted and turned in ways that would have been impossible to navigate without guidance. Just as Elena's air supply was beginning to feel limited, the tunnel curved upward and they emerged into an air-filled chamber. Elena surfaced gasping, treading water in what appeared to be an underground lake surrounded by stone walls that glowed with a faint phosphorescence. As her breathing steadied and her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she began to make out the details of the chamber. The space was vast, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. Stone platforms emerged from the water at regular intervals, creating walkways and shelves that were obviously designed for human use. And on those shelves, protected by the stable temperature and humidity of the underground environment, were dozens of Maya codices, bark paper books covered in the intricate hieroglyphic writing that had been Elena's academic specialty for decades. My God, Elena whispered as she swam toward the nearest platform. James, there are dozens of them. This is the largest collection of Maya books ever discovered. James surfaced beside her, his eyes wide with amazement. Elena, this chamber contains more Maya texts than exist in all the world's museums combined. If these books are authentic, and everything about this place suggests they are. This discovery will completely revolutionize our understanding of Maya civilization. Elena pulled herself up onto one of the stone platforms and approached the nearest shelf of codices. The books were in perfect condition, their bark paper flexible, and their painted glyphs as bright as if they had been created yesterday. She could read enough of the hieroglyphic text to see that these books covered topics ranging from astronomy and mathematics to medicine and spiritual practices. But one codex, placed on a central shelf and bound in jaguar skin rather than bark paper, called to Elena with unmistakable authority. This was the book her bloodline had been protecting, the repository of healing knowledge that the world needed now. Elena approached the jaguar skin codex with reverence, feeling the weight of 5 centuries of ancestral protection. As she touched the cover, images flashed through her mind, visions of Maya healers using the knowledge contained in these pages to cure diseases, to restore balance to ecosystems, to maintain harmony between human communities and the natural world. "This is it," Elena said to Carlos and James. "This is the healing codex that my grandmother's stories spoke of." Carlos nodded gravely. "And now, you must decide what to do with the knowledge it contains. The codex cannot leave this chamber. Its preservation depends on the specific conditions here. But you can study it, learn from it, and find ways to share its wisdom with the world." Elena spent the next several hours studying the jaguar skin codex, photographing its pages, and beginning the complex work of translation. What she found exceeded even her expanded expectations. The book was indeed a comprehensive manual of healing knowledge, but healing understood in ways that integrated physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual dimensions. The Codex described techniques for using consciousness itself as a healing tool, methods for directing focused intention to restore health at the cellular level, practices for harmonizing human awareness with the electromagnetic fields of the earth, ceremonies for calling upon the healing intelligence of plants and animals. It explained how individual healing was inseparable from community healing, and how community healing was inseparable from environmental healing. Most significantly, the Codex provided detailed instructions for what it called the Great Healing, a planetary restoration process that could be activated when enough people learned to work with the consciousness-based healing methods it described. According to the ancient text, the environmental and social crises facing the modern world were symptoms of humanity's disconnection from the living intelligence of the earth itself. The Great Healing would restore this connection, allowing human civilization to evolve into forms that supported rather than damaged the planetary ecosystem. As Elena studied the Codex, she began to understand why her life had unfolded as it had. Her academic training had given her the linguistic and analytical skills needed to understand and translate the ancient text. Her institutional connections would allow her to introduce the healing knowledge into modern medical and environmental systems. Her discovery of her genetic heritage had opened her to forms of knowledge that existed beyond rational analysis. "The Codex explains everything," Elena told Carlos and James as they prepared to leave the chamber. "It shows how ancient Maya civilization achieved the kind of sustainability and harmony that modern environmentalists dream of. But more than that, it provides practical methods for contemporary people to restore that same kind of balance." "And what will you do with this knowledge?" Carlos asked. Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "I'll translate it, document it, and find ways to share it that honor both its ancient wisdom and the need for contemporary validation. It's going to take years of work, and I'll need help from people who understand both indigenous knowledge systems and modern institutions." James, who had been photographing other codices in the chamber, looked up from his work. "Elena, what we've discovered here is going to challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between ancient and modern knowledge. I suspect there will be significant resistance from people who have invested their careers in maintaining the boundaries between primitive and civilized ways of understanding the world. Elena nodded. I know. But the Codex makes it clear that this knowledge is emerging now because the world needs it now. Climate change, environmental degradation, the collapse of ecosystems. These problems require solutions that integrate the best of ancient wisdom with the best of modern technology. Anna's spirit form appeared beside them as they prepared to swim back through the underwater tunnel. Grandmother Elena, you have taken the first step on a journey that will transform not just your own life, but the lives of many people who are ready to remember what your ancestors knew about living in harmony with the earth. Elena looked around the chamber one last time, taking in the dozens of ancient books that contained knowledge the world had almost lost forever. I promise to honor this responsibility, she said to the spirits of her ancestors who seemed to fill the sacred space. I promise to share this wisdom in ways that serve the healing of the world. The journey back to Yaxmal took 3 days, with frequent stops for Elena to process what she had experienced and to begin planning how she would integrate the Codex's teachings into her work. By the time they reached the village, Elena had made several crucial decisions about the direction her life would take. First, she would arrange for an extended sabbatical from the university, using her academic credentials to establish a legitimate research project focused on traditional Maya healing systems and their potential applications to contemporary environmental and health challenges. This would provide institutional cover for her work, while allowing her to pursue the translation and application of the Codex knowledge. Second, she would begin identifying and connecting with other people around the world who were ready to learn and apply consciousness-based healing methods. Carlos had given her contacts for indigenous leaders and traditional healers in other countries who were experiencing similar callings to revive ancient wisdom traditions. Third, she would establish Yaxmal as a teaching center where people could come to learn traditional Maya healing and spiritual practices in their original context, while also developing new forms of education that integrated ancient and modern approaches to health and environmental restoration. The work ahead would be challenging, but Elena felt energized by a sense of purpose that she had never experienced in her academic career. For the first time in her life, she was fully aligned with both her genetic heritage and her acquired knowledge, ready to serve as a bridge between worlds that had been artificially separated for too long. 3 months later, Elena was back in Guatemala City, but her life had been completely transformed. She had arranged her sabbatical and was spending half her time at the university translating and documenting the Codex knowledge, and half her time in Yaxmal learning traditional healing practices from Carlos and Anna. The healing center she had envisioned was beginning to take shape. People were arriving at Yaxmal from around the world, doctors interested in consciousness-based healing methods, environmental activists seeking traditional ecological knowledge, spiritual seekers drawn by the community's profound harmony and wisdom. Elena found herself coordinating between these diverse groups, helping them understand how ancient Maya wisdom could inform contemporary approaches to health and environmental restoration. James Patterson had become Elena's primary academic collaborator, using his expertise in Maya writing systems to help with the translation work while maintaining the scholarly rigor that would be necessary for their research to be taken seriously by the academic community. Together, they were preparing a series of papers that would introduce the Codex knowledge to medical and environmental journals, carefully presenting the ancient wisdom in forms that contemporary scientists could evaluate and potentially adopt. Anna, despite her young age, had emerged as one of Elena's most important teachers. The girl possessed an intuitive understanding of the Codex healing methods that complemented Elena's analytical approach to the texts. Together, they were developing training programs that could teach people how to work with consciousness-based healing while maintaining appropriate safety protocols and ethical guidelines. Carlos had become not just a teacher, but a close friend and collaborator. His deep knowledge of traditional Maya practices provided the cultural context that Elena needed to understand the full implications of the Codex knowledge. His connections with indigenous communities throughout Central America were helping to establish a network of traditional knowledge holders who could support the revival and application of ancient healing wisdom. Perhaps most importantly, Elena had discovered that she possessed natural abilities as a healer that had been dormant throughout her academic career. Working with the Codex methods and learning from Carlos and Anna, she found that she could sense the energy patterns that indicated illness or imbalance in people's bodies, could direct healing intention through focused meditation, and could facilitate the kind of consciousness shifts that allowed other people to access their own healing abilities. 6 months after retrieving the Codex, Elena received a visit that would open new dimensions of her work. Maria Santos, a physician from Brazil who had heard about Elena's research through indigenous networks, arrived at Yaxmal with urgent news. "Martinez, doctor," Santos said, "I've been working with traditional healers in the Amazon for 15 years, documenting indigenous medical knowledge and trying to integrate it with conventional medicine. But in the past year, I've been contacted by healers from indigenous communities across South America who are all reporting the same phenomenon. They're receiving visions and dreams about ancient healing knowledge that needs to be remembered and applied to address what they call the Earth's illness." Elena felt a shock of recognition. "Are you saying that what happened to me here in Guatemala is happening to other people in other places?" "Exactly. Indigenous communities from Peru to Colombia are experiencing a revival of ancient healing traditions. But more than that, non-Indigenous people with ancestral connections to these traditions are also having spontaneous awakenings, discovering abilities and knowledge they never knew they possessed." Santos went on to explain that similar phenomena were being reported from indigenous communities around the world, in Australia, Africa, North America, and Asia. Traditional knowledge holders were experiencing visions calling them to remember and share healing wisdom that had been hidden or suppressed for centuries. Meanwhile, people of indigenous heritage who had been disconnected from their traditional cultures were spontaneously developing healing abilities and receiving guidance about ancient practices. "It's as if the Earth itself is calling for a global revival of traditional healing knowledge, Doctor," Santos concluded. "And your work here with the Maya Codex seems to be one of the most advanced examples of this phenomenon." Elena felt overwhelmed by the implications of what Dr. Santos was describing. If ancient healing wisdom was emerging simultaneously around the world, it suggested that the crisis facing humanity and the environment was calling forth exactly the kinds of solutions that traditional cultures had developed over thousands of years. "What do you think this means?" Elena asked. Santos looked thoughtful. "I think it means that we're living through a historic moment when humanity has the opportunity to integrate the best of ancient wisdom with the best of modern knowledge to create new approaches to healing that could address the root causes of our environmental and social crises." Anna, who had been listening to this conversation with interest, spoke up. "The prophecies of our people speak of this time, when the wisdom of all the indigenous nations would awaken together to help heal the world. But the prophecies also say that this healing can only happen if people learn to work together across the boundaries of culture and nationality." Elena felt a deep sense of both excitement and responsibility. The work she had begun with the Maya Codex was apparently part of a much larger awakening that was happening globally. But that also meant that the stakes were much higher than she had initially understood. Over the following months, Elena found herself at the center of an emerging international network of healers, researchers, and activists who were working to revive and apply traditional healing knowledge. The Healing Center at Yaxmal became a hub for this network, hosting conferences and training programs that brought together indigenous knowledge holders and contemporary practitioners from around the world. Elena's academic work was gaining recognition in medical and environmental circles. Her papers on Maya healing methods were being published in prestigious journals, and she was being invited to speak at conferences on topics ranging from integrative medicine to environmental restoration. But the most significant developments were happening outside the academic world, as the consciousness-based healing methods from the Codex were being tested and applied by practitioners around the globe. The results were remarkable. Doctors working with the Maya healing methods were reporting success in treating conditions that had been resistant to conventional medicine. Environmental restoration projects that incorporated traditional ecological knowledge were achieving better results than those based purely on modern scientific approaches. Communities that learned to work with consciousness-based healing practices were experiencing improvements in both individual health and social harmony. But Elena was also discovering that the knowledge contained in the Maya Codex was more complex and challenging than she had initially understood. The healing methods required practitioners to develop levels of consciousness and awareness that went far beyond what most people in modern societies were prepared for. Learning to work with the healing techniques required not just intellectual understanding, but fundamental changes in how people related to themselves, their communities, and the natural world. 2 years after retrieving the Codex, Elena was invited to address the World Health Organization about the potential applications of traditional healing knowledge to global health challenges. Standing before an audience of medical professionals, public health experts, and government officials, Elena felt the weight of responsibility for translating ancient wisdom into forms that contemporary institutions could understand and utilize. For too long, Elena began her presentation, we have approached health and environmental challenges as if they were separate problems requiring separate solutions. But traditional healing systems like those developed by the ancient Maya understood that individual health, community health, and environmental health are inseparably interconnected. The crisis we face today, from climate change to the emergence of new diseases to social fragmentation, are all symptoms of the same fundamental problem: humanity's disconnection from the living intelligence of the earth itself. Elena went on to describe the healing methods contained in the Maya Codex, explaining how consciousness-based practices could be integrated with conventional medicine to create more effective and sustainable approaches to health care. She presented evidence from pilot programs around the world where traditional healing knowledge was being successfully applied to contemporary challenges. The knowledge our ancestors preserved through centuries of persecution and suppression is not primitive or outdated, Elena concluded. It represents sophisticated understanding of the relationships between consciousness, health, and environmental harmony that modern science is only beginning to discover. By learning to integrate ancient wisdom with contemporary knowledge, we have the opportunity to create healing approaches that could address the root causes of our current crises. The response to Elena's presentation was mixed. Some attendees were fascinated by the possibilities she described and eager to learn more about implementing traditional healing approaches in their own work. Others were skeptical about the scientific validity of consciousness-based healing methods and concerned about the practical challenges of integrating traditional knowledge into modern medical systems. But Elena had expected this kind of mixed response. She understood that the transformation she was advocating, from a mechanistic approach to health to one that recognized consciousness as a fundamental factor in healing, would require time and sustained effort to achieve widespread acceptance. 3 years after her initial journey to Yaxmal, Elena's life had become a constant movement between worlds. She spent part of her time in Guatemala City, working with the university to establish a formal research institute focused on traditional healing systems. Part of her time was spent in Yaxmal, continuing to learn from Carlos and Ana while hosting training programs for healers from around the world. And increasingly, she found herself traveling internationally, consulting with medical institutions, environmental organizations, and indigenous communities that were working to integrate ancient wisdom with contemporary challenges. The healing center at Yaxmul had grown into something that exceeded Elena's original vision. What had begun as a small community nestled in the rainforest had become an internationally recognized center for the study and application of consciousness-based healing. People came from 6 continents to learn traditional Maya healing methods, to participate in ceremonies that opened their awareness to non-ordinary states of consciousness, and to study how ancient knowledge could be applied to contemporary problems. Anna, now 15 years old, had emerged as one of the most gifted healers and teachers Elena had ever encountered. The girl possessed an intuitive understanding of consciousness-based healing that allowed her to work with conditions that baffled conventional medicine. But more than that, Anna had developed the ability to teach others how to access the same kinds of healing capabilities, guiding them through the consciousness shifts necessary to work effectively with the ancient methods. Carlos had become Elena's closest collaborator, and increasingly, something more than a friend. The relationship that had begun as a meeting between distant genetic relatives had evolved into a deep partnership based on shared commitment to the healing work and mutual respect for each other's knowledge and abilities. At 71 and 58, respectively, they had found in each other the kind of companionship that Elena had never experienced in her previous life. James Patterson had made his own remarkable transformation over the 3 years. Initially skeptical about the mystical aspects of the healing work, he had gradually opened to consciousness-based practices and discovered his own significant abilities as a healer. His academic credibility and meticulous documentation of the healing methods had been crucial in gaining acceptance for the work within medical and scientific communities. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of what Elena had come to think of as the global awakening. The phenomenon that Dr. Santos had first described, indigenous communities around the world experiencing revival of ancient healing traditions, had accelerated dramatically. Healers, shamans, medicine people, and wisdom keepers from dozens of different cultures were reporting similar experiences. Visions calling them to remember and share healing knowledge, spontaneous activation of dormant healing abilities, and guidance about how to apply traditional wisdom to contemporary challenges. More remarkably, people with indigenous heritage who had been completely disconnected from their traditional cultures were experiencing sudden awakenings to ancestral knowledge. A software engineer in Silicon Valley discovered she could heal through touch and began receiving visions about plant medicines used by her Lakota ancestors. A businessman in Tokyo started having dreams about Shinto healing practices and found he could sense illness in people's energy fields. A teacher in Sao Paulo spontaneously began speaking in the language of her Tupi ancestors and developed the ability to communicate with the healing spirits of rainforest plants. Elena had become a central coordinator for this emerging global network, helping to connect traditional knowledge holders with contemporary practitioners, facilitating exchanges of healing knowledge between different cultural traditions, and working to establish protocols for safely and ethically applying consciousness-based healing methods in modern contexts. The work was not without its challenges. Some traditional healers were concerned about sharing sacred knowledge with outsiders, worried that ancient practices would be commercialized or distorted when removed from their cultural contexts. Some medical professionals remained skeptical about healing methods that couldn't be explained through conventional scientific frameworks. Some government officials were concerned about the legal and regulatory implications of consciousness-altering practices being used for healing purposes. Elena found herself constantly navigating between these different concerns, working to build bridges of understanding while maintaining the integrity of the ancient wisdom. She had learned to speak the languages of multiple worlds, the precise terminology of academic research, the holistic frameworks of traditional healing, the practical considerations of medical practice, the policy concerns of government officials. 5 years after retrieving the Maya Codex, Elena received an invitation that would test everything she had learned about integrating ancient wisdom with contemporary institutions. The United Nations had asked her to serve as a consultant for a new initiative on traditional knowledge and global health, advising on how indigenous healing systems could be incorporated into international efforts to address health and environmental challenges. The invitation represented both an enormous opportunity and a significant risk. If Elena could successfully influence UN policy to include traditional healing approaches, it could accelerate the global adoption of consciousness-based healing methods by decades. But if the ancient wisdom became entangled in bureaucratic processes and political agendas, it could be distorted or neutralized in ways that would undermine its effectiveness. Elena spent weeks consulting with Carlos, Anna, and other traditional knowledge holders about whether to accept the UN invitation. The consensus was that the potential benefits outweighed the risks, but only if Elena could maintain clear boundaries around what aspects of the healing knowledge could be shared publicly and what needed to remain protected within traditional contexts. The Codex contains knowledge that could help heal the world, Anna said during one of their planning conversations, but only if it's applied with wisdom and respect for the sacred dimensions of healing. You must find ways to share what can be shared while protecting what must be protected. Elena accepted the UN position and found herself based in New York for several months, working with international teams to develop policies that would support the integration of traditional healing knowledge into global health initiatives. The work was both exciting and frustrating. She was amazed by the scope of the challenges the international community was trying to address, from emerging infectious diseases to environmental health threats to the mental health impacts of social displacement and climate change. At the same time, she was often frustrated by the institutional limitations that made it difficult to implement holistic approaches to these challenges. The UN, like most large institutions, was organized around narrow specializations and bureaucratic procedures that didn't accommodate the integrated understanding of health and healing that traditional systems represented. But Elena persevered, gradually building support for pilot programs that would test traditional healing approaches in carefully designed contexts. She helped establish protocols for training healthcare workers in consciousness-based healing methods, developed guidelines for ethical collaboration with Indigenous knowledge holders, and created evaluation frameworks that could assess the effectiveness of holistic healing approaches using both quantitative and qualitative measures. The breakthrough came when several pilot programs began producing results that exceeded all expectations. A program in Kenya that combined traditional healing practices with conventional medicine achieved remarkable success in treating drug-resistant tuberculosis. An environmental restoration project in Peru that incorporated indigenous ecological knowledge helped restore degraded rainforest ecosystems faster and more sustainably than conventional approaches. A mental health initiative in Canada that integrated traditional healing ceremonies with contemporary therapy dramatically improved outcomes for Indigenous youth struggling with depression and suicide. These successes attracted attention from medical researchers, environmental scientists, and policymakers around the world. Elena found herself invited to present the results at international conferences, to consult with governments about incorporating traditional knowledge into national health policies, and to advise medical schools about including consciousness-based healing methods in their curricula. 7 years after retrieving the Maya Codex, Elena was recognized with the UN's highest honor for contributions to global health. Standing before the General Assembly to receive the award, she thought about her grandmother Esperanza, about the long chain of women who had protected the ancient knowledge, about the incredible journey that had brought her from a conventional academic career to the center of a global transformation in how humanity approached healing. The knowledge that Indigenous peoples have preserved through centuries of persecution and suppression, Elena said in her acceptance speech, represents humanity's oldest and most sophisticated understanding of the relationships between consciousness, health, and environmental harmony. By learning to integrate this ancient wisdom with the best of contemporary knowledge, we have the opportunity to create approaches to healing that could address not just the symptoms of our current crises, but their underlying causes. Elena went on to describe the global network of healers and researchers that had emerged around the revival of traditional healing knowledge, the remarkable results being achieved through consciousness-based healing methods, and the potential for these approaches to contribute to solutions for challenges ranging from climate change to social inequality to the emergence of new diseases. But perhaps most importantly, Elena concluded, this work is helping us remember something that modern civilization had almost forgotten, that healing is not just about fixing what is broken, but about restoring the wholeness and harmony that is our natural state. When we learn to heal ourselves, our communities, and our relationship with the earth from this place of wholeness, we create the possibility for a world that works for all life. The response to Elena's speech was overwhelming. Representatives from dozens of countries approached her afterward to discuss how traditional healing knowledge could be incorporated into their national health systems. Medical schools requested assistance in developing curricula that would include consciousness-based healing methods. Environmental organizations wanted to learn about traditional ecological knowledge that could inform their restoration efforts. But Elena knew that the real work was happening not in the halls of international institutions, but in places like Yaxmal, where people were learning to work directly with the healing knowledge that their ancestors had preserved. The global network of healing centers, training programs, and practitioner communities that had emerged around the revival of traditional wisdom was creating a grassroots transformation that was ultimately more significant than any policy changes that could be achieved through governmental or institutional channels. 8 years after her initial journey to find Carlos, Elena stood once again in the sacred chamber beneath the cenote, surrounded by the ancient codices that had catalyzed her transformation. But this time, she was not alone. Anna, now 18, and recognized as one of the most gifted healers of her generation, stood beside her. Carlos, his hair now completely white but his vitality undiminished, smiled as he watched Elena teaching a group of international students how to read the healing knowledge contained in the jaguar skin Codex. The students represented the global awakening that Elena had helped facilitate, a medical doctor from Germany learning to work with consciousness-based healing, an environmental scientist from Japan studying traditional ecological knowledge, a social worker from Nigeria exploring how ancient wisdom could inform approaches to community healing, a computer programmer from California discovering her abilities as an energy healer. The Codex teaches us that healing is not something we do to people or to the earth, Elena explained to the group as they studied the ancient text together. Healing is something we participate in by learning to align our consciousness with the natural harmony that already exists. When we remember how to do this, we become channels for the healing intelligence that permeates all of life. As Elena spoke, she felt the presence of her grandmother Esperanza and all the ancestors who had protected this knowledge through generations of difficulty and persecution. Their sacrifice had made it possible for the ancient wisdom to emerge at exactly the moment when the world needed it most. Looking around the underground chamber at the faces of students from 6 continents, all united in their commitment to learning and applying traditional healing knowledge, Elena felt a deep sense of completion. The journey that had begun with a simple DNA test had led her to discover not just her genetic heritage, but her purpose as a bridge between ancient wisdom and contemporary understanding. The healing of the world that the Maya prophecies had spoken of was no longer a distant possibility. It was happening now, one person at a time, one community at a time, as people around the globe remembered how to work with the consciousness-based healing methods that their ancestors had preserved for exactly this moment in human history. As the group prepared to leave the sacred chamber, Anna placed her hand on Elena's shoulder. "Grandmother Elena, the young woman said with a smile that radiated both wisdom and affection. The ancestors are very pleased with what you have accomplished. But they want you to know that this is only the beginning. The real healing work starts now. Elena nodded, feeling both the weight and the joy of the work that lay ahead. At 76 years old, she had found her true calling as a healer, teacher, and bridge between worlds. The Maya Codex had given her the knowledge she needed to serve this calling, but it was the love and support of people like Carlos and Anna, and the commitment of students and colleagues around the world, that would make it possible to continue the work for as long as her life allowed. As they swam back through the underwater tunnel toward the surface, Elena felt the deep satisfaction that comes from aligning one's life completely with one's purpose. She had spent the first 68 years of her life searching for something without knowing what she was looking for. Now she knew that what she had been searching for was the opportunity to serve the healing of the world through the revival and application of the ancient wisdom that lived in her blood. The surface of the cenote sparkled with afternoon sunlight as Elena emerged from the sacred depths, carrying within her consciousness the knowledge that could help heal not just individual bodies, but the body of the earth itself. The work ahead would be challenging, but Elena faced it with the confidence that comes from knowing one's life is being lived in service to something infinitely larger and more meaningful than personal achievement or recognition. The Maya prophecy had been fulfilled. The blood of kings had reunited, the ancient knowledge had been retrieved, and the healing of the world had begun. But Elena understood now that prophecies are not predictions of predetermined futures, but invitations to participate in creating the futures that serve the highest good of all life. As she walked back through the jungle toward Yaxmul, surrounded by students whose lives had been transformed by their encounter with ancient wisdom, Elena felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. The path ahead was clear, and she was ready to walk it for as long as her ancestors and the earth itself needed her service.